Today, we are here to talk about workers' compensation, what it is, why it matters, and where it's headed. I get to be your fantastic host along this journey. My name is Dr. Claire Musselman, and my goal for you at the end of this session is to be able to understand the workers' compensation system, its impact on all of us, and where it's headed for the future. If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Claire Musselman. I am the glitter bomb of workers' compensation. You will never find somebody more passionate or more purpose-driven than I am about this industry. This is my home. I love it. I've been here for over 20 years. I love innovating and researching and figure out how we can make this system better. If you want to connect with me, this is my email, my website. You can look me up on LinkedIn, ask questions, comments, concerns, feel free to call or text. But with that, let's get to why you're here today. So I want you to think about workers' compensation as a whole. Most of the time when we say workers' compensation, people get this dreary opinion and we think very black and white. If you think back to the opening screen, we have the gentlemen that are sitting on the beam over New York City, and it's just very much a dreary system. And I want you to think a little bit differently after this presentation. I want you to know what workers' compensation is. Let's debunk some of the truths, because as much as people want to say this is a freeloading, fraudulent system, I'm here to tell you that there's no yachts coming in this system. But we'll talk through some of the core concepts and the fundamentals behind workers' compensation. And we're going to talk about why it matters. Why is this such a big deal? And especially now, it is becoming an even more imperative system that we've really got to be paying attention to. And also, where's it going? What are the trends that we see? What are some opportunity areas? And what can you do about it? So let's talk about what workers' compensation is. So truly, this is designed as a no-fault system to help provide two types of benefits: medical care and wage replacements to people who have been injured on the job, and also protect employers from lawsuits. And we'll talk through the history of work comp in just a second, but that's what work comp is. It is to provide two types of benefits. Let's help the people who've been injured, and we will get them indemnified, or we will help provide some of the wage replacement that might be missed as a result of an injury. So when we think about workers' compensation, outside of those two benefits, there's two other things that are super important. We also think about return to work, and also the legal protection aspect. So medical treatment, if somebody's injured, we need to fix it. So we need to provide medical treatment to get that employee taken care of, back to work, back to life. There are some nuances, there are some intricacies around this, but basically, if you get injured, we're going to fix you. The wage replacement piece. This is where we got to love the work comp system and the 50 states plus federal laws and a couple other little nuances that exist there, and everybody is different. But ideally, the idea is to replace some of the income during an injured worker's recovery period. So from injury to getting back to work, back to life, this is where we want to focus that wage replacement piece. Then there's the return to work. Our goal is to restore the livelihood of the person who's been injured. This is the insurance industry. Our goal is to restore the livelihood of people. Workers' compensation makes no difference, except this, we're working with somebody's actual physical body. And human beings, complicated, can hold more than one emotion at a time. And life's pretty easy until you complicate it with human behavior. So our goal when someone gets injured is for us to get them back to work and back to life. And so those things go hand in hand, and that has to be on the forefront of an injury. But that is our main goal. If someone gets injured, we're going to fix you and get you back to work. And then the whole legal protection thing is also very important. This is actually why workers' compensation was created. It helps employers from the lawsuit defense standpoint. So let's talk through this a little bit more. What happened? Why do we have workers' compensation? So around the industrial time period, so we're going to go back like 100 plus years, workers' compensation came because it needed to address the labor in the industry and what was going on. There weren't a lot of laws and regulations. Some states had adapted some others hadn't. We have the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City in 1911. There's all of these things that go on. Well, when we look at the Industrial Revolution, this created a lot of hazards, and we had a lot of dangerous workplaces. So this would help, there are these unbelievable workplace hazards. Injured workers would then not have an adequate support or legal resource when they were injured. Now, with that, it also came that there wasn't a lot of protection for the employers should the injured workers actually want to take any type of legal recourse. And it ended up flooding the court systems. So what do? We put some rules, regulations, laws, and statute in place, and we design a system that is created to provide prompt medical treatment, meaning quick medical treatment, which I will come back to momentarily, and rage replacement for injured human beings. This also then had a mutual protection that would shield employers from the costly and uncertain lawsuits. This became like a very social impact really movement that came across. So in the early 20th century, there was that recognition of the inequities that existed in the system. And the courts were overloaded. So we needed to find a way to kind of create a balance across all of these different lines. And thus, you get the workers' compensation system. Now, each state decided to come along at their own time period. So you will see a very different plethora of laws, rules, regulations, and statutes that are administered during a different time period because each state has their own system that they like to operate in. So making things easy and complicated. So how does workers' compensation work? All right, we're going into what is workers' compensation. Someone gets injured, all right? There is an injury that takes place. Ideally, a claim is then filed immediately. Now, lots of things can go on in this time period, but we're going to talk about this as if it's a flawless system that operates seamlessly and effortlessly. So an injury occurs, claim gets filed. Then we get that person medical treatment immediately. States have their own rules, regulations, if you can send somebody somewhere or if they can choose where they go, but we're not going to talk about that one today. We're just going to identify how the system works. Claims filed, we go get some medical treatment. This is how we start to move back into that back to work, back to life. There is an investigation phase that occurs during this system. This is where we look to see if there is coverage, and I'll cover that here in just a second, where a claim is either deemed compensable or not compensable under workers' compensation. And the language matters because if you look at the rules, regulations, and statutes that exist in workers' compensation, you do not see accepted and denied, and I will die on the grave on this one. It's either compensable or not compensable, and remember, you're working with human beings, so language matters. All right, then there's benefits, okay? So if somebody is going to be off of work, what kind of benefits do they qualify for? Each state has very specific requirements that are available on every state's website. So there is no, we try to be as transparent as we possibly can in the system by outlining here is what the state says you qualify for when a claim is deemed compensable under workers' compensation. There's also some little nuances that come into play, like if there is lag time, a waiting period that then could delay the benefit situation. And we'll cover that a little bit in a second. Then we have the return to work and the recovery phase. So this is how do we accommodate somebody? Are they able to come back to work right away? This is what we refer to as modified duty. And again, language matters. We don't talk about it as light duty. This is modified duty. A lot of intricacies that go into that as well, because while it might be a modification that is needed for an employee to return to work, we also want to be aware that when people are on the recovery journey, they might be doing the best that they can. Maybe they have a 10-pound weight restriction, and that is really hard for them. To demean people and call it light duty can be received poorly, and thus we use the language of modified duty in workers' compensation. And then there's the closer phase where the claim closes, forms are filed statewide, and we move on from the claim. So ideally, injury happens, we treat it medically, investigate to make sure it's covered under workers' compensation, pay the benefits if there's any that are needed to be paid and owed, especially for the medical treatment, get somebody back to work, back to life, claim closes. Should be that simple. Again, human behavior, complicated. The system, as much as we would love to say that the system works flawlessly, we have areas of opportunity. So come with me. So who gets involved in the workers' compensation process? I just explained the claims side, but there's other people that get involved in the workers' compensation process. So There is a complex ecosystem that exists that involves a lot of different players when we're looking at workers' compensation. We have our underwriting friends that assess those risk profiles and they determine how the policy terms are going to look in the specific states, as well as the premiums that are associated. This is where we have to work hand in hand with our employers to look at job classification codes and to actually see the work that they state they are doing. There are also insurance carriers and TPAs who will be managing the claims. If you are self insured or you are self funded, this is where we start to look at who is actually administering your claims. And then we also have state regulators. Again, workers' compensation is very specific per state where an injury occurs. So, this is where we have to really pay attention to what are the rules, what are the regulations that are specific to the state the employee has been injured. And regulators, I heard this the other day from a former regulator who said, this system is designed to leave everyone equally unhappy. And I kind of laughed at it, except that that kind of is the perception overall. So things to think about as we move on. But also, I want you to think about it from this landscape. If you are here watching us today, where do you fit into this picture? Other people that tend to be involved in this space include the injured worker. They are the center of this giant ecosystem that exists. They're at the center. Once an employee has been injured, we are now in that injured worker territory. We then have the employer. You've got the direct supervisor, who is probably one of the most important people that are involved throughout this process. We also have human resources. We also have safety. There might be a dedicated workers' compensation professional who is at the employer. There might be on-site nurse case management. There might be an occupational health nurse or an occupational health provider. There's a lot that can go in on the employer side. We have the insurance carrier TPA for the claims management, depending on how your program is structured, who will be adjudicating the claim. Then we have the adjuster, who is trying to navigate all of the intricacies that arrive at this junction with the injured worker and the employer and all of the state rules, regulations, and keeping things compliant. Then we have medical providers who are going to be providing that medical treatment, getting that person back to work, back to life, and doing so according to the guidelines that are produced in the medical community. And then also we have legal involved when disputes arise. Something to be aware of is that when a workers' compensation claim is filed, and a lawsuit can come from this, it is against the claim itself and not necessarily against the employer. There tends to be a common misconception of this is that the employer is getting sued, and actually it's the work comp policy. And I want to specify that because that is where some animosity and some differences of opinion can arise. And we want to be very crystal clear about how this system works. But if we look at this, there's a lot of people that get involved when someone gets injured. And this is why clarity in communication can be really important across the board. So, where do you fit in on this? I have this lovely ability of being on all sides of the equation at some point of my career, which is one of the reasons I'm really passionate about this. I also could add in that I've been a family member of someone who has also been injured. So when you start to look at this ecosystem, each one of these areas has a different phase or a different lens or perception that they are approaching this system with. And so if you are someone that has any influence over this or decision-making capacity, the ability to articulate and communicate in a consumable manner towards all of these parties is one of the fortes for success in this system. Okay, so compensability. This is one that I like to get really passionate about because a lot of times people are like, it was denied. Correction. Actually, they're deemed non-compensable. So let's talk through the compensability factor. So we have a workers' compensation policy. A claim has now been filed against that policy. We have to determine the coverage. So first of all, is it within the policy limits? Does the employer have coverage? We go through that. And then the workers' compensation system has a different threshold that has to be met. For an injury or a claim to be considered compensable under workers' compensation, it has to occur in the course and scope of the employment. So let's check this. What do I mean by that? The injury happens while the employee is performing duties for the employer or engaging in activities incidental to their work. So got to be clear on how is this happening. Then we look at the scope. So the injury occurred within the time or place or something that the employee was reasonably expected to be working on or activities related to their job. There has to be a causal connection to the employment and the injury. And this is where each state gets a little wonky because there can be, if you're coming to work or going from work, there are different coming and going rules. There's also a deviation from employment if you're out driving, and each state has very specific nuances that can factor into this, which is why, from an employer standpoint, get your claims filed and let the claims professionals determine the compensability piece. A lot of times we see employers that want to say this is accepted or this is denied or I don't trust this or I want to deny this. That's not your job, nor do you get any say in that. Like, you have now purchased workers' compensation insurance, or you have people who are adjudicating workers' compensation on your behalf as an extension of you. Your claims adjusters will do their due diligence and investigate the claims to determine if the injury does fall within the course and scope of employment. And they do a lot of due diligence on this because each state has such specific requirements, and there's always the one-offs that have to truly be investigated to make sure that we are providing adequate coverage. Things to be aware of, and this gets to be a very sticky piece from time to time, just to make sure that we know what we are talking about, how we are accepting this or finding it non-compensable. The other piece of this that falls into play is if it's not going to be covered under workers' compensation, are there other benefits that the employee qualifies for under the employee or employer? So if your employer also offers personal health insurance that the employee has opted into, a claim may not be compensable under workers' compensation, but then can be picked up under personal health. Hey, employers, guess what? You're paying for both. You might as well use the leverage. If something's not going to be compensable under workers' compensation and your employee does have personal health insurance, make sure you're making that connection because that can help you not get sued. Very fun. There's a lot of things that we can easily connect the dots to in this system to make it easier for all parties involved. Sometimes we just tend to be lazy and take the path of least resistance instead of taking that extra step and making sure that the injured party is then taken care of. So this separation between what role people play within this field can be really powerful and important when we all start to work together. Things to be aware of. So I'm going to ask you to come into the human side of this, which is kind of how I'm here and why I go out as the glitter bomb of workers' compensation. There is a very human side to this. This is a human being that has now been injured in an unforeseen circumstance. And when we as humans get injured, it puts us into a vulnerable space because we are no longer able to actually understand that our body can show up for us. It has now been injured, wounded, and a lot of other things come into play. This is where we look at some of the biopsychosocial issues that can impact workers' compensation. So I first want to say that behind every single claim, there is a person, not a claim number. When we start to go down those roads, or we call people a claimant, this is a human being with a family and a life. What ends up happening is we have a person, let's say, that injures their shoulder. Now they need to heal, get on that road to recovery, but guess what? These people have lives. They have jobs that they need to do. They might be part of a family. They also might have extracurricular activities, any type of philanthropy. And on average, most people are carrying around about 7 balls at a time, where just different roles that they play within their life, and also people who actually depend on them. So when we take this into the human side, and I ask people to remember that there's a human being on that other side, we are then asking someone who has been injured in an unforeseen circumstance just by showing up at work and doing their job and having just an accident occur. We are then asking them to go on this road to recovery by basically asking them to operate like everything is normal in their life, but do it while we tie their arm behind their back, ask them to operate and navigate a system that is designed with intent of recovery, but it's also really hard to understand the laws and statutes. We put a lot of regulations around this. So we ask people to try and navigate a system that's hard to understand and have all these different people that are going to be taking control over certain elements of your life that you used to be in control of. Oh, and make sure you heal yourself appropriately. Make sure you continue everything and make sure that you also get on the road to recovery as quickly as possible. So we've got to think about what goes on with people as humans. And a lot of this is triggered through stress, through the fight, flight, freeze, our amygdala, our hormone levels such as cortisol and adrenaline and inflammation, and all of these factors that come into play. So this is where we have to think back to the human side of workers' compensation. There is a human that has been injured. They are likely experiencing pain. They are likely fearful of the unknown, because this process isn't something that, one, is the same state to state, and also can be adjudicated very differently depending on the employer and the relationship between the claims professionals and the employer. Also, how involved people choose to be while their employees are going through this recovery process can also lead to a big impact. Plus, people don't know what they don't know. And those of us that come from the workers' compensation system tend to forget that people don't know what they don't know. So we want to think about, how can we help alleviate the fear of the unknown? How can we walk people through this process to be able to have some understanding about what is coming next, so that they can have some type of sense of control? Here are the benefits you qualify for. We can help you with wage replacement while you are on your recovery path, and your medical benefits. How well are we doing at explaining this to people, whether you're on the employer side or you are on the adjusting side? This can be really powerful. It can help avoid confusion. And this is where we start to see a lot of animosity build in this field, where people don't understand what's happening. They don't understand the why, and no one is taking the time to explain it. So we really need to utilize empathy, providing that understanding that this is a new experience for the most part. And also, I've been an injured worker, embarrassingly, 3 times. Each experience has been vastly different. Sometimes I've had an amazing experience, and other times I have not. I've also watched one of my parents go through this system, and it's also fascinating and frustrating to see how people treat other people. When we look at communication and clarity and explaining the fears of the unknown to people, that clear communication can make all the difference. And just because you get it doesn't mean that that person understands the manner in which you're speaking to them. Statutes are hard. They are not written at the level that people can understand. And that is why those claims professionals are so important throughout this process. And a lot of times, employers don't know what they don't know either. This might be the one time of the year, or maybe the one time, like in the past 6 months, that something has happened. And so we put this like undue pressure on people to be able to be the experts in this, when really you need a good process and you need a good communicator that helps people understand from a consumability standpoint of what is coming next along this process. When people feel seen, heard, acknowledged, and valued, and I will bring that up here again shortly, they feel that they are going to have better outcomes. And guess what? When people feel understood, they have a lot of their Maslow's hierarchy of needs met, their stress levels reduce as a result, decreasing cortisol and adrenaline. And guess what? Their body heals faster. Here is where science, biology, and psychology all come together to actually showcase that treating people like human beings can improve your outcomes. Novel concept, right? Go back to kindergarten, where we learned how to treat people and asked people to come play with us in the sandbox and brought people along with us. A lot of this stuff is going back to everything we learned in kindergarten about how to treat people in a situation like this. So here are some common misconceptions that exist throughout this process. Number 1, it's just a medical claim. Okay. And also, I do not like the word but. I like the words and also. You'll hear me say that for the next couple of slides. Correct. It might just be a medical only claim. Absolutely. Might just be medical treatment that is needed, and there is no lost time. However, there is still an injury to a human being, and the body still needs to repair itself. So whether or not there is lost time, there has still been an injury to a person, and we need to help make sure that that person knows how to handle their recovery journey. Plus, in this day and age, we have these beautiful things called cell phones, and it takes about 10 seconds to check in on someone. So regardless if you are the claims adjuster or you are the employer in this, there is no excuse to not follow up with people, to just check in and see how they are doing. Workers fake injuries all the time. Statistically speaking, no. And you are more than welcome to email me for the 12 studies that I have on this. Actually, when you start to look at dollar for dollar of workers' compensation fraud, we see a lot more fraud on the employer side. We also see a lot of fraud on the medical side. But for an injured worker to come into work and blatantly lie about an injury is about 1% to 2% overall of the workers' compensation system. 1% to 2%. And for those of you that want to come back at me and say, well, that's not been my experience. Maybe. And also, there's this other piece called soft fraud. Soft fraud tends to happen when a ball is dropped within the first 48 hours of an injury. A lot of times people will blame the claims professionals, but I'm here to tell you that in all of my research over the past 20 years, a lot of times it's that first 48-hour window of what happens between an employer and that injured worker and how we set the tone for what is coming next. So if we think back to this is a person, how are we going to make sure that they are seen, heard, acknowledged, valued, and they understand what is coming next throughout this process? I love the fraud piece. The other thing is that we spend a lot of time fighting claims instead of putting processes in place to actually help people be successful. So my question to you would be, where do you want to spend your money? Fighting against a system or actually building something that works to create an organizational culture where people understand if I get injured, my company is putting me back to work, back to life as quickly as possible. Here is the why behind it. It's very fascinating when we start to break this down and look at the why. If you have these claims that you believe have been fraudulent, I would encourage you to look a little bit deeper and see where was the ball dropped. Now, again, there are the claims that are absolute fraud. Totally understand that. And I agree with that. There are some of those that exist. But we tend to look at this from oh, they were injured. Oof, I bet they're lying. Instead of actually looking and exploring into, okay, what happened? Why did this happen? What was the cause of the injury? Got to remember that this type of fraud, the hardcore fraud where people are coming in to file a claim and nothing truly happened, tends to be more rare. And so we want to think about, all right, how do we alleviate some of the soft fraud that exists within this system where we see longer time off of work, we see more prescriptions filled than needed, lying about mileage. There's some things that can come from that. Why does that happen? Where did the animosity begin to build? And what can you do to fix it? Next thing, once it's filed, it's out of our hands. Okay. Yes, and there's ongoing collaboration needed throughout the entire process. Once the claim is filed, the claims adjudicator is going to help throughout this process, but the employer still needs to be actively involved. The direct supervisor needs to continue to keep in touch with an injured worker because that's your employee. This is still your employee throughout this process. Now, some of these situational aspects might not be within your control, but you can help navigate the process and enhance the communication that comes with it. And then our job is to minimize payout. Let me be very clear on this one. The state dictates what you're going to be paying. There are clear rules and regulations across the board about how things are going to be paid. Calculations are based upon prior wages. And when we start to look at this is very state specific to the statute that has been outlined. So the payout, what we really want is to focus on the back to work, back to life, and getting somebody back into their life, back into their workplace, where we focus on the care and the outcomes tend to follow. So a lot of interesting pieces that come into this, and it has such this negative connotation that's affiliated with it, where I would like to challenge you with the yes and statements versus the but statements. So the truth is workers' compensation is about care and compliance and connecting the dots along the way and connecting them back to that injured human being so that they know what's coming next, where you can alleviate the fear of the unknown, help them with some of their biopsychosocial issues that can exist from this, and the rest of it ends up taking course, and the outcomes can be much better when we actually put the effort in where it needs to go. So let's talk about the fraud piece a little bit more. Injured workers misrepresent or fabricate injuries for undeserved benefits. Show me the yachts. Wrote an article about this. Show me the yachts. Show me all the yachts that are existent. Some misconceptions that exist within this system. When an injured worker is off work and they are receiving benefits, on average, it tends to be about 2/3 of their prior average working wages, and it's not taxed, but big but on this one. If the employee does have personal health insurance or any type of benefits from the employer, those still have to be paid. So while the injured worker might be getting 2/3 of their wages without taxes like no taxes being paid off of this, they still will have to write a check back to the employer to make sure that they don't lapse in their personal health insurance, or maybe if they have a 401k set aside, whatever it is, whatever those benefits look like, still has to be covered. Work comp doesn't touch that. So there's this misconception that it's like, well, they're getting all of this free money. Is it? Double check. Double check your policies, double check how your companies operate. And remember that there is always more that meets the eye when we actually get to the facts and the figures and what truly happens, not just what people say. So understand that being an educated consumer of information can be really positive and very important on this. And this information should be delivered to an injured worker up front so that they know that you might get an invoice from us, because we still have to pay your health insurance premiums. So this will be reiterated back to you. Now, some companies do choose to pick it up when their employees are injured and are like, no, don't bill them for it. We'll just take care of it. Again, I would refer back to the employer's policies and procedures around this. Let's get into the other areas of fraud that exist here. Employer fraud. I saw this a lot when I was on the insurance carrier side. Businesses misclassify employees or underreport payroll so that they can reduce their insurance premiums. And this is where underwriting and audit come hand in hand. So claims professionals have to report back to underwriters and let audit know, hey, we saw something fishy. An example I can give you is a president or a CEO of a company is on the roof changing light bulbs on one of their signs, but is deemed a clerical employee. If it's a clerical employee, they shouldn't be on the roof changing light bulbs. So we have to actually think about that, because that was an injury I have actually handled myself, which then went back to underwriting and audit, because that's not the job that the person was doing. Things to think about. And if you are one of those people who has been through a payroll audit, sometimes we will go through line by line. What is this employee's job? What do they do? Things to think about. And then got to take a little stab over here at California, because you guys, that state keeps producing amazing cases that showcase the fraud that exists within the medical community, especially when with workers' compensation. We just saw another decision that was rendered towards a medical provider that was a $25 million decision based on billing services that aren't necessarily being rendered or overcharged, upcoding, and unnecessary treatments. So when we look at the fraudulent space as a whole, there's always more to the story. Be an educated consumer of information before we start to attack an employee who might have a legitimate injury. All right, so let's talk about the system in two constructs. What's broken? What's beautiful? All right, the broken piece. When there's delays in care, all right, we have more abilities now than ever to be able to render medical treatment quickly and get things triaged, have first aid administered quickly, telemedicine, nurse triage, you name it. There shouldn't be delays in care. The moment that injury gets reported, we figure out, what does this person need? Always start by calming the person down, get them a glass of water, and then we figure out, all right, what's next? Everything is figure outable. We just need a plan. And this is where we want to make sure that employers understand the process and that all of their employees do too. When an injury occurs, this is what we do. And a lot of employers have no idea how to communicate this to their employees, and workers' compensation tends to be on the red herring side. So things that we want to be aware of, that communication can be important, because what it does is, if there's poor communication, it erodes the trust along the process. When people don't know what they're doing, there's a lot of misinformation that can be communicated, and as a result, you end up with adversarial relationships. But what's beautiful about this system is that people heal and they can come back to their purpose and their meaning and doing things that truly fulfill these people. And also, I want to caveat this in this moment and remind everyone that workers' compensation is not a remedy for poor hiring decisions. That is for a different time. But this is where you start to see how your employees are treated, or how people are treated throughout this process actually either builds loyalty or erodes it throughout this process. You can build a better, more cohesive safety culture as a result, taking these as experiences to learn from and to make tomorrow better than it is today, which can then help increase trust with your employees and preserve their dignity. Yes, that is what we want. So why does this matter? The human impact ends up being really important. If we think about turnover and finding quality employees, like when we hire people into our companies, this is important that they feel that we are going to do the best for them and they're going to do the best for us, kind of a two-way street. So if something unforeseen happens and there is an injury, this is where we look at how do we handle them with dignity and with care and trying to keep them involved, that they still belong here. And it's just a one-off that they had an injury. So let's take care of the process and move it. Let's talk about it from a business aspect standpoint, because everything in life is a business strategy. You just have to be looking for it. When we look at cost containment, you can help contain costs by starting the concept of return to work day one. Not only is it better for the injured worker from a psychology standpoint, really focusing on their life force pyramid and making sure that we are going to try and make that injured worker back, getting them back to their life, back to their work, feeling that they are whole again. But it's also a great way to keep your costs down. Focusing on that return to work right away, quick medical treatment, making sure follow-ups are followed through. All of this ends up helping with cost containment because balls don't get dropped and things are followed up upon. The proactivity nature in this space is where you start to see cost savings. You can increase productivity and reduce your litigation, all by having clear, consistent, repeatable procedures that are communicated with clarity. Think 6th to 8th grade level and maybe even down to 5th grade level. That is where we should be talking to people. And when we go look at statutes, that is not the way that they are written. Things to think about. And also, your workers' compensation program, how successful or unsuccessful it is, absolutely determines your organizational culture. How you treat your people will spread throughout and will permeate that culture. So if things are going well, people are going to be cared for and they're like, yes, I know my employer's got my back. I'm going to do my best to get back. I want to be with my team. Or is it, well, go figure, they don't care about me and we have a very different speed of which people are going to feel throughout this process. Things to think about. So I talked about this a little bit. There are a lot of jurisdictional nuances that exist within this space. Each state operates with its own policies and procedures. So I have 50 states, 50 variations up here. Don't forget, federal government falls under a different category, as do a couple of other one-offs. But this is the things that we need to be aware of within the different state parameters. Waiting periods are different. That is, how many days do you need to be off work before benefits kick in? And that's that wage replacement benefits. Choice of physician. Some states the employer gets to pick. Some states the injured worker gets to pick. You've got to be aware of who that is. Now, even if you can't pick the medical provider, sometimes employees are going to turn to you and ask, hey, do you have any suggestions of where I should go? Things that you should have in your back pocket. And then how wage replacements are calculated is different state to state as well. Now, roughly, if you average all of the states, it ends up being about 2/3 of an average weekly wage. But I live in the state of Iowa. We have our own charts that are produced annually by Iowa Workforce Development that depend on someone's marital status and their dependents. So each state, again, has their own nuances, tricks to the trade, and statutes that are going to be very specific to where the injured worker is located when they are injured. This matters because compliance and collaboration go hand in hand. Also, the benefits that an injured worker qualifies for are all listed on state websites. So it's very good if we learn how to communicate it so that we can help the injured worker, because if we don't, they will find someone who can, or they will do the research on their own. And we really should have taken that effort to make sure that they understand things in a consumable fashion. This helps alleviate litigation, build some trust, transparency throughout the process, because there's no reason to hide things when the states tell you right on their website how the claims should be handled. Things to think about. So let's think about, where are we going in workers' compensation? There's a lot on the table right now with mental health. And this is where we've seen a lot of integration between the biopsychosocial model and to what happens to someone when they're injured. It isn't just a physical injury to their body, but there's a lot more that goes into play, which is why I asked you to think about it from the 7 balls in the air. Each state has their own qualms with this mental state, but it's something to be aware of how an injury takes place and how someone recovers. Trying to pay attention to what are those nuances and how you can actually fill in some of the gaps to help people feel seen, heard, acknowledged, and valued throughout this system. Preserving dignity will do you the best every single time. We're starting to see, well, we're not starting to see, this has been in the play for a while. We've got predictive analytics. We've got ways that AI and automation can really help streamline this process so that the people end up being at that forefront where we've got people helping people. One of the most important aspects of this is having an injured human being feel that they are being heard by another individual. We also see a lot more of these advocacy-based models where it really is, how do we best support the injured worker? Only you can figure out what you are willing to do from an employer standpoint. And as a claims professional, don't be a jerk. All right. These are injured human beings who are in a very vulnerable state. Yes, people get frustrated. Humans are complicated. And also, we have seen that the worker centric approaches tend to do better. We get people back to work faster, back to life faster, and they have an easier road to recovery. So, how we're training our adjusters can make all the difference, as well as how we are handling this from an employer standpoint. Then we also think about that belonging and inclusion of really making sure that we are meeting people where they're at. If we have injured workers that do not speak English as a first language, do you have all of your processes, procedures, forms, you name it, outlined in the language that they speak, meeting people where they are at? So this is something that we have to think about. Look at your employee population. Are you meeting the needs of your employees? Things to think about, easy, low-hanging fruit that can be addressed to make this process a little bit easier. Then we also see regulatory shifts. A lot of states like to update things annually, so there's always something new to learn in our system. Plus, we are starting to see an acceleration in technology as we see states from a form filing and a compliance standpoint as they move into a more automated approach, and also filing things electronically versus paper. We are almost all the way there in all of our states. Here's moving forward. Okay, so AI, we've got a couple of ways that it has been working and a couple of ways that we will see continuing to come to the fruition of this landscape. Predictive analytics are not new. These have been used, I don't know, at least the whole time that I've been in the system, which is about 20 plus years. So this is where we start to look at how do we reduce certain areas based upon our historical performance. Now we can do this based on different industries. We can look at it as the whole, as the workers' compensation system, but how do we use prior history to help us predict what's coming in the future? The great part about the prediction by basing it upon the past is that human behavior is always interesting and changing, and you will have those one-offs that come regardless. However, it can give a good historical picture and help you find ways to reduce your lag time, get better return to work, see where your gaps are and where some leakage could be from either a lost time perspective or from a medical treatment standpoint. Chatbots are also really helpful. A lot of times people just need some questions answered, and you can have chatbots that can help answer these questions. Now, granted, I told you that everything can be found on a state website that tells you here is what you qualify for under workers' compensation. And also, it can be really hard to understand, and not everyone is technologically savvy to be able to understand where to go to source this information. So, having a chatbot that is available to help you either file your claims, maybe help with some triage, and have some frequently asked questions can really accelerate the response and the communication needed for an injured worker. Then we also use this from a risk scoring standpoint when we're looking at the underwriting and the audit standpoint that can help. One, from what's going on the employer side, but we also look for fraud detection. Are there any red flags? Did somebody get injured over the weekend? Are they not returning phone calls? A lot of things that can go into that. And we use algorithms to help us predict, is this person going to need a little bit more hand-holding or not? A lot of this is determined by the biopsychosocial, which this impacts the social aspect. Maybe there's an issue with the work history. Maybe there's an issue with some pre-existing medical conditions. Maybe there's some things going on in their personal life on the social landscape that could inhibit their healing process, taking care of an adult, a child, a parent, marriage issues, financial issues. A lot of those things can impact this as well. So we use ethical considerations and pay attention to some of our human judgment that makes this process essential in how we move forward. But AI, not new in work comp, just being utilized differently and talked about more on the forefront. Okay, so let's talk about the behavioral science. This is where I get really excited about this. People don't just need the information. First of all, human beings tend to only be able to process about 3 pieces of information at a time before we check for understanding. This is where if you see a lot of presentations, people usually have a 1, 2, 3. Just interesting when we start to look at how people actually consume information and how we choose to deliver it. In workers' compensation, we tend to overload people with information right at the forefront. Here's everything that you're going to need to know about your claim. Here are all the processes. And what we fail to realize is the human side of this. We are asking somebody that is now in a vulnerable state, that has high levels of cortisol and high levels of adrenaline, to retain information while they are starting this process of understanding, I have been injured. Okay, everything is figure outable. I'm going to be able to get from point A to point B. Okay, how am I going to get there? And when we start to look at this about what's going on with a person, this is where we like to have our adjusters. You've got 24 hours to make contact. We've got 24 hours to talk to the doctor. We have all of this. Are we surprised that people get confused? I'm going to tell you from a behavioral science standpoint, absolutely not. Humans are going to be in a state where they are not necessarily in the best place to receive information. And this is why we've got to find multiple ways to teach people what they need to know to help alleviate some of the fear of the unknown. This is why sending things to people's houses in the good old fashioned snail mail can be helpful. Following up in an email can be helpful. Sending things in a text message can be helpful. And also calling, having those conversations, trying to find different mediums that can help somebody understand what is going on. Because people don't just need the information, they need to understand that there is certainty that this is going to get figured out. We are going to get you on the road to recovery. This is not the end. We're going to get you from point A to point B. We need to build trust. Here's what we're here to do. We're not out to get you. We're here to help you along a process that can be pretty gnarly in the process. Here's what I need from you. Here's what you can expect of me. Here's what I'm going to expect of you, regardless of if you're the claims professional, the injured worker, or the employer. Here is what you can expect of me. Here is what I'm going to expect of you. Outlining expectations, looking at the accountability standpoint and whose responsibility is it where. And if the ball gets dropped, who's following up? Things to think about. This helps build that emotional support that is needed to get somebody on that road to recovery from point A to point B. We've got to remind ourselves that people need to feel safe first, and then they can start that healing process. What tends to happen is we stress people out. We don't give them all the information. And when people feel stress, it increases their cortisol levels. We have your body pumping epinephrine into your muscles tighten, you start to have shortness of breath, and it causes an increased amount of stress. Well, here's the funny part with that. When we start to stress out our injured workers even more than their bodies are already feeling because of the injury, it inhibits their healing process because of the inflammation that occurs as a result of an increased level of stress. Human tissue cannot heal when the body is inflamed. So this is where trying to alleviate the fear of the unknown and helping reduce some of those stress levels with increased communication, making communication consumable for the desired party, making sure that they actually understand what's coming and how to get from point A to point B, alleviating those fears that might be coming up for them can help lower some of those hormonal responses that can then help the body repair itself. Novel concept, right? Guess what? Here's all the science that goes into that. The other thing that we want to think about is the capability plus opportunity plus motivation. We want to look at this where what are we actually looking at from this injured worker standpoint, creating opportunities. If we want to bring you back into the work environment, here is what we can do. Your physician has given us these restrictions, and here's what we have found for you to do. And then pulling that motivation, what matters to these people. We have to know our people more than a claim number to be able to understand what's truly going to motivate them to get them back to work, back to life. Think about those 7 balls. Some of them are family, some of them are recreational activities, some might be hobbies, but everybody's got something that can help spark some of that motivation to get the behavioral aspect of what we want to see in this road to recovery. We just have to take an extra step or genuinely care about the process. So the employer's role, this impacts your culture so vastly, so vastly, because how you are treating people, and even if you're letting things go to just the claims team on this, you as the employer still have an active role in this process. The claims adjudicators are here to help you along the way, but these are still your people, and it is your role and responsibility to make sure that things don't get dropped. it. So supervisors set a huge tone for this, having a follow-up after an injury that's just like, hey, I was checking in on you, making sure that they stay involved of just, I want to make sure you're doing okay. I'm just checking in. Do you need anything? These little tiny things can make all of the difference. And when there's empathy and there is ongoing communication, people are less likely to go talk to an attorney because they are getting their questions asked. If you're not talking to them, somebody else will. Things to be aware of. So we need to make sure that we have supervisor training for our employees across the board so that when someone is injured, people know what to do. A lot of times we keep this as a red herring and we don't talk about workers' compensation because, oh, evil workers' compensation, send them off to the island of misfit toys. No, it should be an ongoing, this is what happens if somebody gets injured. Here's how we do it. Every employee should be aware of how the process works. So at least having first response protocols and teaching some empathy skills. Huge factors for reducing your costs that are affiliated and actually sparking some increase in your employee engagement across the board from an organizational standpoint. Having some modified duty policies that are talked about from day one. When you're injured, no, we're going to get you back to work. We're going to get you back to life. This impacts your culture because if you are going to see any type of fraud coming through, this will help inhibit future fraud cases to come through because if your employees know if you're injured, they will get you back to work quickly as they can, back to work, back to life. That deters people from wanting to file claims that might be fraudulent because you're going to put them through the rigmarole of getting them back to work, back to life. So again, I ask you, where do you want to spend your money? Fighting fraud or being more proactive about getting these return to work policies and procedures up on the front end to deter people from even trying to do it in the first place? This becomes your organizational culture. And also having those successful transitions, ask people like, how is this going? Just even checking in. You don't have to do anything with the information, but that check-in piece can be really important. And we look at the adjuster's role. Okay, so I talked about how injured workers have, 7 balls that might be going on. Adjusters have a lot. Not only do they have to balance everything, they are looking at balancing multiple perspectives. So they have to administer the policy accordingly. They have to also establish human connection and be unbelievably timely in their processing. In order to do that, they need information. They are only going to be able to do as much as they can with the information provided. Sometimes wages get delayed in the process of administering and getting those checks out to injured workers because the employer doesn't give the adjuster the information timely. This is a partnership. So adjusters need proper tools and training. They need that organizational support. They need to have that ability to build with their employer and have some reasonable caseloads, which is a whole different topic, and clear expectations. Whose responsibility lies where? And having this clearly outlined can be really helpful, but these guys do wear a lot of hats. And while they're going to do the best of their ability, the information provided to them to get the ball rolling can be really important. So make sure they're on your team too. Then we look at the legal and the risk lens. The legal perspective. Got to make sure that we are being compliant, and every state has their own way of doing this, but this helps us keep things fair so that things are adjudicated fairly and consistently, regardless of the employee. Also, how do you navigate your disputes, right? If things are going to not go well or we are going to have a dispute, how are you going to try and resolve that? This is where if a ball's going to get dropped, you want to know about it as an employer so you can help either be a bridge to talking to the adjusting team or figure out, okay, what's going on? What's happening? A lot of times we see unreturned phone calls are a big issue. A missed payment can be really important, or people will get a medical bill to their house, and then they automatically think workers' compensation is not covering my claim. Not true. You just got to tell us. We need to know because then we can fix it. Most of the time, it's just a quick switch of insurance that somebody forgot to do when they were keying in the system. These things are not big, but they do become big when things are dropped. One of the other ones that can be a really big factor is not telling people about mileage. Guess what? It's a state benefit and they qualify for it. Make sure you tell them. And the other is if a prescription gets denied. There is nothing more irritable to an injured worker when they are leaving surgery and they can't get their prescription. It's not being approved through the system. It doesn't matter if that prescription costs $4 or $200. The fact that it is now coming through as denied sends a very clear message to the injured worker, whether the intent is there or not. This is where we look at intent versus impact. Again, doesn't matter if it's $4 $200. The fact that they can't get a script for a surgery that was approved under workers' compensation can change the tone of a claim drastically. Things to watch out for. We also want to look at data trends from a risk management standpoint to see if there's any patterns or prevention that we can work with. And also, there are wonderful ways that you can look to fund your workers' compensation system, such as captives and self-insurance models. If you have good control over your claims and over the organizational culture of your people, those are some really great benefit options that you can explore down the road. There's a lot of opportunity. Work comp works best when everyone works together. Again, putting that injured worker at the center of this. So sharing information. Information is power, keeping it clear and concise. Again, know your audience, know what they anticipate, what's coming next, and help alleviate the fears of the unknown. Timeliness is important. We live in an instantaneous society where people get really frustrated if you're not texting back in 15 seconds or responding to emails quickly. Now, set the tone, explain to people, set yourself up for success on this. And also remember, we live in an instantaneous society. So if you're having a lag time and you're not reporting your claims to somebody for over a week, that's never going to work. So you need to fix the issues now. Our shared goal is getting somebody back to work, back to life. Focus on that and make sure that your messaging, regardless if it's the employer, the claims adjuster, or the supervisor, we are all one voice in our consistent messaging. Want to reiterate this, that injured workers in this process want to feel that they are seen, heard, supported, and valued. They want to know that their experience is being acknowledged. So listen actively. They don't necessarily need you to do anything. They just want to feel like they're being heard and that their concerns are validated. Validation is a huge emotional intelligence skill set that we really need to be training our adjusters and our leaders on. They want supported. If they don't know how to do something, they want to be supported through the process. Help me. This is a hard space. Help me. And they want to be treated with dignity. Not hard to do. You're not a claim number. You're a human being. So something to think about. What happens during this process? When we see Joe slips on a floor, we have an instant first report. What are we going to do with it? If the supervisor shrugs it off and is like, it's just Joe, it'll be okay. Shrugs it off, what we see happen is there's a delay in reporting, and maybe that desk or that injury report sits on the supervisor's desk. Well, now we've missed the reporting window and the claim gets denied. So the injured worker is going to go hire an attorney to get their benefits, and boom, we have now at least tripled the cost of the claim. If the supervisor would have just said, hey, Joe, are you okay? Do we need to do anything? And then followed up afterwards. Still reporting the claim as an incident, but then following up to make sure that Joe was actually taken care of. Easy things, but the domino effect ends up being a pretty big deal. So if we reimagine the system as to what it could be, when everything works the way it's supposed to, and we're restoring the lives of people to get them back to work and back to life, this is where we see instant reporting, where that documentation is done easily. You can do it from your phone. There's a few pieces of information. I think there's about 7 fields that most claims teams need. The rest of the information the claims team can go get on their own. Get it over to them. Treat people with dignity, with empathy. You don't have to agree with what's going on, but you can hold space for someone to tell you what has happened and what's going on. You as the employer, take that information, pass it to the claims team. This is not your judgment space. This is where the claims team knows what they're doing. Plan that return to work on the front end. And remember, everybody's gotten invested in outcome in this. So share that ownership, establish those expectations, figure out who's responsible for what, and hold people accountable. We're not going to let those balls drop. We're going to be proactive and take care of our people that are involved in this system. What makes this system effective is having clear roles and responsibilities. Who are the stakeholders? What do they do? How are they held accountable and responsible? Making sure you've got compliance so that you've got consistency across the board, and that your communication is transparent, because they go hand in hand. And if we put the worker at the center and really focus on their well-being, everything else tends to fall into place. And that makes the system effective. So what is workers' compensation? It's a safety net for both people, both parties, to facilitate the treatment or medical treatment for injured workers and get them back to work, back to life. Why it matters? It helps safeguard employee well-being, supports a supportive workplace culture and drives organizational resilience. It also helps protect the employer and the injured worker throughout this process. And where is it headed? Well, that's kind of up to you. This is where the future needs that human-centered approach. We can utilize leverage technology, we can utilize some collaboration and design some optimal outcomes throughout this process. And with that, let's make workers' compensation better together.